Hi there. I am Pauletta Hansel, and I am with the Urban Appalachian Community Coalition Story Gathering Project. And I'm really excited today to be here with Chris Smith. And even though I've said your name, Chris, I'm going to ask you to say your name again and tell me what neighborhood you live in. And also, just because it's so interesting, I'm going to ask you to tell us what you do for a living.
Hello, I'm Christopher Smith. Most people call me Chris. I live in the Coreyville section of Cincinnati, and I'm a reference librarian working at the main library in downtown Cincinnati. And I've been doing this for a lot of years.
So what Chris did not say is that he is generally recognized as being the king of genealogy
Oh, well, thank you. I am in
at the
genealogy and local
library.
history, so it's my
Yeah,
specialty.
yeah, and everybody says he's really good at it, and I can tell you that myself. When more or less, you don't have to give out your ages directly if you don't want to, but when and where were you born, Chris, and where did you grow up?
I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio in late 1963,
Okay.
and I was born at Good Sam Hospital, me and my brothers. And I grew up in Cincinnati, grew up in a lot of different neighborhoods throughout the city.
Yeah, which neighborhoods?
When I was born, we lived in Forest Park.
Mhm.
My parents divorced when I was about 5, and we moved into with my grandma and grandpa and great grandma and my brothers, and we lived in Wyoming.
Okay.
And those were just really special times because we had 4 generations under the same roof. And
Wow.
it was
Wow.
just incredible because you don't hear about that happening so much.
Yeah. So what were the generations? Were it like great grandparents,
Yeah,
grandparents?
my great grandmother, my grandparents, my mother, and my brothers, and
Okay.
myself.
Yeah. Now, were your parents also born in Cincinnati?
Yes, my mother was born in Reading, in the
Mhm.
Reading section, and my father was born in Coreyville.
Okay. Okay. So you're back to your father's roots there in
I'm pretty
Coreyville.
much back to where my family, at least that side of my family, lived for a few generations.
Yeah, wow. But then beyond that, where were your grandparents and your great grandparents from?
Well, on my father's side, my grandparents were both born in Cincinnati. And on my mother's side, my grandfather was born in Cincinnati, but my grandmother was born in Nicholas County, West Virginia.
Okay. All right. So that's
That's
where
my connection.
yeah, that's the connection. And that's the family you lived with growing up. Is that right?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. And so did that's your grandma, did she ever talk about West Virginia or
She talked
about
about it a lot.
yeah, what did she say?
And she was young when she left. It was my great grandma that talked more about it.
Mhm.
Um, I guess that's really not fair. My grandma came to Cincinnati when she was only 5 years old.
Okay.
Um, so she remembers coming into the city and just never having been to a city like that and seeing she said, I couldn't believe the buildings and all the neon. And she just, the height of cities in the late 1920s.
Yeah. Wow.
Um, and my great grandma, she was she was born in 1902. So she would have been 25, 24, 25 when
Hmm.
she came here to the city. And he and her husband, my great grandpa, Jim,
Hmm.
they grew up in this Nicholas County, Summersville.
Hmm.
Um, and my great grandma was a school teacher, and she taught school at the Methodist Church, which was also served as the schoolhouse during the week, and the church on the weekend, on Sunday. And my great grandpa wanted to start a newspaper, and they just couldn't find work, and that's why they left.
Yeah.
And they came west to Cincinnati.
Did
And
they, did he start a newspaper?
he did. He ran a community newspaper out of his basement with his own printing press.
Wow.
And he did that. He was a jack of all trades kind of
Yeah.
a guy.
Yeah.
I never knew him. He knew me. He died when I was maybe 6 months old,
Yeah.
but I was the new baby in the family when he
Right.
died.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and so that was Wyoming, is that right? Is that what the community newspaper
At
was?
that time, they moved between Arlington Heights and Lockland.
Right.
At that time, they were either living in Arlington Heights or Lockland. They moved periodically, and this is all before I was born, so I'm not really
Yeah.
sure exactly of the neighborhood, but it was one of those two.
Yeah, and that is along the Mill Creek there. That is an early that is a place where the earlier migrants would have lived. So they were probably living among other urban Appalachian people at the
Oh,
time, would
I
be my
know they were because there were relatives and friends that had kind of followed them from
yeah,
Nicholas County. And
yeah,
they lived in, as my grandmother always called it, we're out in the valley, different
yeah,
neighborhoods out in the valley.
out in the valley. I've heard that before, but I had not really thought about it in terms of the urban Appalachian history. Well, have you ever seen a copy of the newspaper your great grandpa did?
I never did. It was more or less like a community paper,
Uh-huh.
but apparently there are copies that exist in a box that my mother has.
Okay.
But I have not gotten a chance to look through that box. There's quite a bit in there. I
Yeah.
found some letters written from my great grandfather to my grandma.
Yeah.
And those were just, I think I get my dark sense of humor from my great grandfather, actually, after reading those letters. But that was just a door opener for me. But no, I never did see the actual papers themselves. I'm hoping there's some in that box.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure you'd love to get your hands on those
I
one of
really
these
would.
days. So, so did your parents or your grandparents or your great grandparents ever talk about being Appalachian or being from the mountains? I mean, being hillbillies? I mean, did they use any of the terminology we hear now?
They did. My grandmother in particular, I spent a lot of time, I was one of those nerdy little kids. I spent a lot of time talking with my great grandmother, and she would tell me stories about growing up on the farm. Um, and while they were in West Virginia, she said, like, for example, which I thought it stuck in my head, she said, and way back on the property, there were these old abandoned cabins. And she says that she was told that they were slave cabins
Hmm.
at one time.
Mm-hmm.
But she didn't know anything more about that because this was
Yeah.
years before she was born. But my grandmother, she treasured her Appalachian past, and she was very offended by the term hillbilly.
Mm-hmm.
She did not like that.
Mm-hmm.
She said, we are mountain people,
Good for her.
but we are not hillbillies.
Yeah.
But even though she left West Virginia when she was 4 or 5 years old, she forever considered herself a West Virginian.
Yeah.
And she would go back to visit family
Mm-hmm.
throughout her entire life.
Did you ever go with her?
I never did, because by the time I came along and by the time I was old enough to go, I remember them going once or twice, but I was real little. And I think she just didn't think to ask me.
Yeah.
And I was too little really to invite myself necessarily.
Yeah.
But I got to know, because some people stayed in Somerville, Nicholas County, their whole life. But then there was a lot of Lena, and Lola. They were her aunts, and two of them came to Cincinnati, followed her.
Okay.
One was an artist. I have a painting of Mount Adams that she did.
Oh, wow.
I have it hanging in my home. It hung above their fireplace my entire, younger life.
Yeah.
But she just treasured that part of her family and that part of her past, and she never let go of that connection.
Yeah.
And I got so much out of her about that, but I'll never forget her saying she would read the word hillbilly and she would just be very offended by that. She said, we are mountain people. And I'll never forget that.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's something.
Yeah. So I've got two different questions. I'm going to put a hold on one and ask you this one.
Sure.
How about your how about your mom? Did she identify with having grown up with a mom from Appalachia? Did she think of herself that way at all?
My mom treasures that part of the family without a doubt.
Uh-huh.
And she was able to go visit in West Virginia a couple times.
Okay.
And she was young when she did it, but she has memories that really stick in her head. My mother's almost 81.
Yeah.
And she has memories. I just talked to her yesterday, and she has told me this story a number of times over the years. But one was she was at her great grandfather's house, and this would have been in the late 1950s.
Mhm.
And they were visiting, they were there for a week or more. And what she remembered is that her great grandmother was cooking, constantly cooking, because they grew everything that they ate,
Yeah.
whether it be animals or plants.
Mhm.
And it's just, as a smaller kid, the things that stick in your head. And she said there was always a big bowl that was never emptied, where she kept making biscuits for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner. That bowl was always in action.
Wow. I love that. There's a metaphor in there someplace,
There
isn't there?
is, but she said the biscuits were with every meal.
Yeah.
And they had pigs on the farm and chickens that she remembered. And the way she described it was the house was like carved into the side of the mountain.
Yeah.
And they had a lower porch and an upper porch. And if you were on the upper porch, you could look down and see the fields that they were farming. I mean, the way she described it, it was just so beautiful.
Well, it is. Have you been I know you didn't get a chance to visit them, but have you been to the Somerville area at all?
I've been to the Somerville area, but I didn't know we don't have kin there that I'm aware of right now.
Right.
We probably do, and I don't know them. They would be my generation or younger.
Right.
And my grandmother always kept in touch, but then they passed away.
Yeah.
And my mom has kept in touch, but over the last like 15 years, 20 years, the people she knew had died.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we probably do have kin there, but I didn't. But I was able to get there, and there's a cemetery there where a lot of my folks are.
Mm-hmm.
And the Groves Raider Cemetery.
Okay.
In Somerville.
Yeah.
Or it's actually near Somerville.
Right.
It's in Nicholas County.
Yeah. 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 No, I think I mentioned to you that I lived in Beckley for about 4 years. And I just thought that the Somerville area, which was a little southeast, maybe, I don't remember exactly.
I think it is.
Was so beautiful. I thought it was the most beautiful place in West Virginia, that area.
It's just gorgeous.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to my great grandma and saying, was it hard for you to leave?
Yeah.
And because she was a young woman, and she says, well, I was in love, and his family had been there as long as my family.
Yeah.
And it was hard, but she said, we really had no choice.
Right.
They had to. They had a young daughter who was my grandma. She was 4 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and they had no choice. There was just no jobs. There was no way to make money.
Yeah.
And so they came to Cincinnati, and I don't recall what brought them here, if someone was already here.
Right.
I think that's interesting. Some of those stories
The
are
stem and
sadly
branch.
lost to time.
Yeah. The stem and branch families, is Mike Maloney of UA Urban Appalachian Community Coalition talks about how that keeps happening, that people
It
talk
does.
to each other.
Because I do know a lot of people and I met them, who came to Cincinnati following my great grandparents.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah. And I'm really glad that you agreed to be interviewed and to talk about this, because these stories of early migration are ones that I think it's just been harder for us to collect, because the people are gone, right? I mean, we know a lot about after World War II, and and even into the 70s, or in my case into the late 70s. I came here in 79, but those early stories are so interesting, and to keep that family connection too. Now, I do want to I want to make sure we talk a little bit about the fact that you didn't kind of start digging into this story consciously until you met a professor. Is that correct?
It is. I kind of knew about my family past. I did, but I met Roberta Campbell, and she was a professor I had at the University of Cincinnati. She was a very proud Appalachian, and it just inspired me. The things that she would say, I ended up writing a paper, kind of like a senior thesis, if you will, and I focused on 3 different Appalachian women from different time periods, 2 of which were no big names by any means, and then the 3rd was Loretta Lynn.
Wow.
Because I love her.
Yeah.
And I'd always loved her. I grew up just enamored by her talent and her music,
Yeah.
and her story. And it just related to, I don't know, it made me think of my grandma.
Yeah.
And Roberta was just such an inspiration for that. I don't know if she realizes that, but she was just so passionate about what she taught. And I'm so grateful for that. There's a few teachers in my life that I've had that have been really inspirational in that way. She was definitely one of them.
Well, she'll find out how inspirational she was now when she sees this.
Oh God, that's right.
Hi, Roberta.
Hello, Roberta. Thank you.
So that's I love that connection between the earlier days of the Urban Appalachian Council and you rediscovering your own roots.
And she was the reason I discovered the Urban Appalachian Council.
Yeah.
I used to go to their library at 8th and State, and I used to spend hours there.
Oh, wow.
Going through their books. And then I know for a brief period, I think they might have had one at 8th and State and up in Price Hill up on the hill.
That's correct. Yeah, that was, yeah.
But this would have been in the mid 80s.
Okay. Well, it's while I was working there at the time. I was either a board member or a staff member during that that time. Yeah. So we almost met back then, right?
Nice. But they were such friendly, and it was very eye-opening. And I love the city because of my other aspects of my other people in my family. So I knew the city really well. And then I started to learn how Over the Rhine was such a bastion of Appalachian culture for a period. And parts of my family had been in Over the Rhine as well, but these were other elements of my family going back even further.
Yeah.
Before the Appalachians, they were German immigrants. Right. So
yeah. Now, Mount Adams, I want to get back to that for a minute because you talked about, I guess, what your great aunt or great aunt having you're having a picture painting of Mount Adams.
I do.
And did she live in Mount Adams, or she just found it beautiful?
She lived out in the valley.
Okay. All right.
They all lived out in the valley. And I know the valley is consumed in many neighborhoods.
Right.
But growing up, we knew what neighborhood we lived in. But whenever I heard, I live out in the valley.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess that's an Appalachian leftover. I don't know.
Yeah, probably.
But that's the way I was always told. And even my mother to this day, she refers to that as out in the valley. Yeah. Because she grew up with that.
Yeah. I love that.
But yes, it was Lottie, and she was a painter. Mm-hmm. My brother has a painting by her. I have 2 paintings by her. And she was I don't think she ever sold them or made money. She just painted them for the family.
Yeah.
But she was very talented, and she would paint scenes around Cincinnati. Okay. And it's interesting to get the perspective from people who did not grow up here, but they fell in love with this city. And I think part of that, it was their new home, but it was also hilly, which I probably sort of reminded them of home. The topography, I don't know, but they seemed to focus on that. And I have 2 beautiful paintings, one of Mount Adams, one of, what is the other one? Burnett Woods.
Okay. So she just found the most beautiful places she could. And
she just found beautiful spots. And I've gone to all those spots where I could find them. and sat there. The one in Mount Adams, sadly, I think it's mostly gone now for the freeway. But like the Burnett Woods, I actually went to the bench and sat on that bench. And I said, this is where she sat and painted that picture.
Yeah.
And I look at that every morning. It's right above my dresser. So I just treasure that.
Oh, that's lovely. So do you feel like that this family connection to the mountain, these family stories, do you feel like that there's any way that it has helped kind of shape who you are right now and the choices that you've made?
I'd like to think that it does and has. I'm real sensitive to those stories, and I can get all emotional. And I listened intently to those stories as a kid. I would sit in my great grandma's room. She had two beds, two single beds, and her rocking chair was in the center. And one bed was filled with all her sewing and everything else that she would do. And I would sit next to her sewing stuff, and I would just ask her questions, and she would talk to me for hours. It's also how I watched Paul Dixon and all these other shows from when I was a kid. But yeah, I do feel like there's a connection because it just became a part of me. And then I did the same thing with my grandma, and I try to get these stories out of my mom. So I'd like to think that, yes, it's a part of me, and it's helped to make me a part, at least a part of who I am.
Yeah, I mean, it feels that way to me because now you're like giving so much of your time and your energy and your passion to these stories that are other people's stories as well as your stories with your work at the library.
It just means a lot to me. And I guess that's part of what I do here at the library, because I do genealogy, I do local history, and you're always hearing other people's stories.
Yeah.
I just had a patron come in last night, an older woman of Chinese descent. And it turns out, don't mean to go off on another story, but she was fascinating. And her grandfather had started the first Chinese restaurant in Cincinnati.
Wow.
Which I had heard of. And the only reason I had heard of it is because of my love for Doris Day, who performed there in the late 1930s when she was like 15 years old.
Oh, that's amazing.
And our story, it's just another example of how stories come together.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I helped to tie some of those together for her. And that's an example of the elements that I love about working at the library, because you never know who's going to come in. And when you're doing genealogy and local history, like I said, everybody has stories, and we all have stories to share. And you just never know what you're going to learn.
Yeah. Well, before we end, I just want to make sure if there's any other story that you want to make sure gets recorded here.
Boy, that's really hard. I just think of my grandma and my great grandma more than anything. There's this one picture on the farm in Nicholas County that I have framed and hanging on my wall. It was my great grandmother's treasured possession. And it is a colorized photo taken about 1905, 1906. And she's about 4 years old. And they're playing croquet in front of the house. And her Aunt Ollie and Uncle Bob are in the picture. And there's this little Ethel who's about 5. She says she was 5 years old in the photo. So that would have been 1907. She was born 1902. But she's just so cute. And I guess that picture is what inspired all of this, because I'd look at that, and just being the history guy that I am, it just blew my mind. And this was in 1907. And I'm not sure when it was colored, because I'm sure it wasn't colored then, but it was tastefully colored, as in painted. And that was missing for years and years. And I found that in that box that I gave to my mom, where I think the newspapers are. But now that's framed and hanging up. And yeah, it's just my great grandmother and her Aunt Ollie and Uncle Bob. Those are the two people that raised her. And because her mother died when she was just 2 years old. And so it's a treasure. So I guess really that's where it started from. So thank you for letting me share that.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. And I am gonna, we are gonna have to go ahead and sign off of this
Okay.
interview, but I think that I would just love to talk to you some more. So who knows, we might be having a Chris Smith interview part 2. But
Thank you, Pauletta. Thank you.
thank you so much, Chris. And I will go ahead and stop the recording and say goodbye to our friends who are watching.
Thank you for listening.